Because we submitted it and had presented, actually got great reviews, but at a control conference.
CDC?
Yes, at CDC. And we were actually shocked that the people received it so well, because really the main purpose is very applied. Like, I would call this an applied theory paper. Its main point is to solve like what we think is a like real problem, and like address real limitations through theory. And yeah, maybe that's too big of a goal, but we worked a lot on it, and it's actually this paper is very dear to Ben and I heart. Yeah, so I look forward to any comments or questions you have. You can interrupt me during the talk. I think I'll be able to like adjust timing, whatever. So okay. And yeah, I think this will be maybe a somewhat informal talk.
Yeah.
Can
be more of a discussion. I would probably just add things available.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I'd love discussion because I think there's many points that, yeah, maybe like I think usually we get a lot of questions like, oh, how can you model things this way?
I connected with Jenna as well after because she's not here now, but she's the one who works on chemotherapy.
Yes, that'd be great. And also I can think more about like how this would apply to to different dose responses than the ones we consider here. So, okay, not yet. Okay, it worked. Sorry. I'm always like confused how to change the slides. But yes, so we're looking at the problem of tapering medications and addictive substances. And I think people already know that this is a big problem, but one kind of very sad statistic that Ben actually first shared with me when we started working on this, and I think it's quite moving, is that, for example, in like 2020, 2021, 2022, there have been more overdose deaths in San Francisco than of COVID. Yet I feel like in my area, at least, I've seen a lot of research on COVID and not really any on tapering. And hopefully I'll convince you that like machine learning, online optimization, control theory, and even like reinforcement learning can all like actually like naturally fit this problem, and that there's a lot to contribute. Yes, other statistics are for opioids, there's like an 80% relapse even after people go to a detox program. Also, the current, even people who do engage in tapering, they find that this is again for opioids, that they're actually more likely to overdose after the tapering, or just have a mental health crisis. And this doesn't cover just opioids. The problem of tapering, in my opinion, is like very, very broad. There's a lot of psychoactive substances out there and addictive substances out there. Very common one where I come from in Romania is smoking. And so people are really, lots of people smoke. It's quite unhealthy and it's really hard to quit. Like I know my parents have tried to quit so many times and it's just, people are really struggling with it. And beyond, these would be more class, like this is the addictive substances part, but also, and it's very good that we have SSRIs now and antidepressants, but quite a huge chunk of people are put on antidepressants, and sometimes they do want to come off of it. And antidepressants have notoriously bad withdrawal side effects. You get brain zaps, well, you get a lot of different side effects. And also more recently, there's been an increase also in prescriptions of stimulants, usually for ADHD, especially in adult ADHD. These withdrawals aren't as intense, but they still could really impact quality of life. And beyond that, there's benzodiazepines, there's a lot of different substances. So here, I'll say that this work is mostly inspired by psychoactively addictive substances and like psychoactive medications. I would say like the applications are generally thought to that, and it is an open question like to what, like when that could this framework help tapering of other medications that do not induce tolerance in the way these examples do. So
it's part of the problem that the tapering should be kind of individualized, or
yes,
because otherwise people would have to figure like a general
yes,
way to.
Exactly. So this is what we're trying to solve, and this is how it ties to Ben's interest in N of 1. It's N of 1 medicine here. This is not an N of 1 trial. This is not an N of 1 estimate of a treatment effect, but it's an N of 1 approach to tapering in particular, or to dose selection. So yes, exactly as you said, like there has been there's like a lot of papers on tapering different medications of the sort we're interested in. So yeah, like the main challenge, the main limitation in our opinion is that these papers work in a very randomized controlled trial approach. They propose like a predetermined algorithm such as decrease a dose by 10% every week. And they test that in all patients and then estimate an average treatment effect. And it's really here, there's no way to convey like how many papers there are. And it's like one paper says, rather than stopping the medication all at the same time, we stop it by decaying it by 20% every week. And they show increase in well-being or decrease in relapse on average. And then there's another paper that shows, okay, now we consider like a 10% decrease and so on. And they do this per rate, per type of decay, like either you decrease the dose linearly or exponentially. And yeah, per medication. So, and per metric. Like, for example, there's a result that shows average treatment effect, like average, like decrease in average withdrawal intensity according to one metric. And then that paper, that study is done again with another metric, for example. So yes, so these are just examples. So there's no currently like no really any knowledge of optimal tapering schedules. And yeah, generally everything is all right. So these are the limitations. So this is what motivated us to work on this. The first limitation we saw, as noted, is that there's a lack of adaptivity to individual patient needs. There's one scale and there is one tapering schedule, but someone might be able to withstand more withdrawal if they are in a rehab center versus if they still have to go to work every day and it's a demanding job and they have to do it because they need to pay bills. And this is simply not accounted in this one-size-fits-all approach.
Do we also know like what signal should inform an adaptive tapering schedule? Like it seems like there's been a lot of trials or like papers on just like a fixed schedule and its effect. But do people know, like for some drugs, what, like if we are to like adapt for individuals, like what would be a biomarker, or like what signal would inform the adaptation?
So what I think these would be metrics. So they have designed like objective withdrawal scales, then subjective opiate withdrawal scales, then SSRI withdrawal scales. So what is used would be these metrics. Our method will work, or our model takes in any metric. So it generalizes that. It could be a subjective effect. It could be how well you're feeling on a scale from 1 to 10. So, but generally I would say that there are metrics that are commonly used, and a first start would be to show improvement in those metrics. Yeah, the second limitation is there doesn't seem to be much of a generalization across substances. Like, because of the way this is approached, there's a decrease of 10% tested in Prozac, and then there's one in another SSRI, and so on. And of course, there's some transfer of knowledge, but there is no like predetermined, there's no like every new tapering protocol requires its own new RCT. And yeah, for example, for certain medications such as like Adderall or stimulants in general, there aren't even really any tapering protocols proposed because the withdrawal effects are not strong enough to justify. So people are usually told to just quit if they want, but that can be quite debilitating. And of course, because these are all experimental approaches, there's no formal guarantee. There's only the guarantee of what was observed and measured in an RCT. But the patient, and this is like what motivates Ben and I in all of our work, the patient actually has no way of knowing how they will feel as an individual. They only know on average in this RCT, according to this metric, this is how people felt. So our approach is to frame individualized tapering as an online optimization problem. So we formalize it as an online optimization in a dynamical system. So this would be some response of the patient on a scale. We call this well-being. So it alternatively, you could have everything in terms of withdrawal intensity, and then every sign would be flipped. And this would be the measured well-being of the patient, like a subjective effect scale. And this is a cumulative effect of past doses. So we model the well-being at time t+1 as a sum of effect from a linear time invariant system. So G0, if we sum from 0, would be some instant effect. So the effect on today of how I feel today of the dose I just took in the morning. Then G1 would be the effect of how I feel, the effect of the dose I took yesterday on how I feel today, and so on. And this is a very common very common model in online control, or in general in control. And of course, I think here is where like there's one modeling assumption that it's a linear time invariant system. But I would say that we start for this because it like yields really, really nice and interpretable results. And we do have an appendix on generalizing this to nonlinear systems. And we're working on like the generalization, even like to make it more understandable.
But that doesn't assume that the system is memoryless.
No.
Because I think that would be like you still have cumulative effect.
Yes, you do. Yeah, that's a key part. Yes. Yeah. So I would say that
it's not like a crazy assumption.
Yeah, and I would also say that like what runs our heating system, and what like controllers that are deployed in medical devices, the core ones would be proportional integrative derivative controllers, and they're all actually based on linear time invariant systems. So I would say a lot of things that run the world are actually are derived formally for linear time invariant system, and then we observe that they perform quite well when deployed on more complicated real life systems. And so the thing we want to optimize is to minimize the cumulative dose, which we call by U, so over some tapering horizon T. And we impose constraints that would be patient-defined withdrawal intensity or well-being. So we want to minimize the cumulative dose such that the well-being at every time is greater than some baseline. For example, the patient says, I never want to feel less than a 5 out of 10. I don't want to feel like a 3 out of 10. And finally, we have this thing here, which is the current state is not just defined by the cumulative effect of past doses, but also by some underlying natural progression. So this is a very common parameterization of a control system called the EULA parameterization. I think it's from the 80s, and then it became very popular in this line of work called online non-stochastic control. But the nice thing here is like this natural progression is what would have happened had you just quit the medicine, like if you stopped taking. So there's a lot of detail here, but it allows for like deviations that are not mean zero from the model we proposed. It allows for Saturdays I feel better and Mondays I feel worse. And it allows, it actually also allows us to encompass all the effects of past doses that we do not know on our system. So how our, like sort of all the tolerance we have developed.
So, but then the individualization comes from G, like the patient is a system that has some impulse response.
Yes, and from Y-min.
And but you don't allow for any stochasticity in like how the patient responds to the dosage, right?
So I think the individualization comes through G, why not, and Y-min. So the individualization through G comes through this, like the cumulative effects of, or like the individual effects of past doses could behave differently in different patients. So that's one.
Oh, but you assume that you know G, or
this is would be at the end. So we derive what's optimal to do if you do have full access to the G, and then we provide a approximate protocol with formal guarantees that only assumes knowledge, like rough knowledge, like a rough lower and upper bound on G0. So it assumes that the patient knows the immediate effect, not knows it fully, but is able to say that like a rough range of like what the effect would be. And this rough range could be initialized either through averages, because the thing is that like this will, our protocol will still adapt to the individual patient, because we just need like, you need to be within, like, if you are within 50%, it already does really good. So you don't need to like know this parameter, you just need to have a rough guess on it. And this is like this would be a patient by patient thing to like discuss with the patient, like when you take this medication on this scale, like in what range does it affect you? And yeah, the other sources of individualizations are the natural progression. So this accommodates for when stopping a drug, different people might react differently. Some might recover very fast, some might recover very slowly. It also captures differences in lifestyle, because the reason actually we don't accommodate stochasticity is because this is completely adversarial. Like this is completely arbitrary. So in a way, it's more general the stochasticity.
yeah, it's like absorbing any noise
Yeah.
to that on.
Yeah. So yeah, so that I think part of individualization. And finally, there's the individualization that like every patient is allowed to choose their own baseline of their limit of what they can tolerate. And I think that's a key component, because, for example, in all the studies, there's a lot of people who drop out of the study because they just feel too bad because the protocol doesn't address their needs. So now, to get all our results, and the reason we focus particularly on addictive substances and usually psychoactive medications is that we will impose one assumption on this system G, these responses. So this assumption comes from here, it's kind of hidden. I had like a citation, but this assumption comes from work in addiction that's quite popular called the opponent process framework. This was done by Richard Solomon in 1980. And he postulates, I think postulates is the word, that the psychoactive tolerance response is given by the fact that like when you take a substance, one dose, there's an immediate acute effect. So either a relief in withdrawal or just an increase in some subjective experience. And this would be, yeah, either pain relief if it's an opiate or craving relief. Followed by tolerance, and that like sort of takes your baseline a bit lower. And here it's quite exaggerated in this plot, but the idea would be like, of course, if we could, this rather than well-being could be serotonin activity, let's say, though it's hard for it to be serotonin activity because no one fully understands exactly the effects of doses on serotonin activity. But how it kind of works in, for example, SSRIs is that it's kind of believed that the medications produce increase in serotonin like uptake and that like quantity in the brain, but then that over repeated takes, the repeated times you take this substance, your receptors like downregulate so that they over time either produce less serotonin or absorb less. And this is all extremely debated, but it does seem that this general form corresponds to a lot of how currently they're thinking.
So like short-term good effects.
Yeah.
And when as you
yes.
like as you
take
further in time from the time of administration, it has bad effects.
Yes, because if we look,
yeah, that seems like very specific to psychiatry and like
it does
like hormone regulation.
Yeah, so it would be in general anything that has this any medication that has this response that your body like adapt produces tolerance to it. So it would be from my read of the literature, it is generally assumed to be in most psychiatric substances. Funnily enough, it's in fitness. There's the general adaptation syndrome, which like models increase in muscles as a response to stress. So that actually like is an inverted form of this one as well. And yeah, in addiction, it's extreme. This model is extremely common.
But like in the toxicity example that I was talking to you before your talk, probably that would be the case. Like,
yes,
so probably you just have bad effects right away.
Yes. So then, for that case, it would be this model would work. It's just that it would be maybe maximize the cumulative dose subject to this would be toxicity, so it would be less than or equal to, and it would be interesting to derive like what happens under here there would be no negative part. So actually it might even be a bit easier.
I don't know like how like this the opponent process assumption like makes the solution easier. I was just thinking like in toxicity, it's like it's all negative.
Yeah.
But then like it like the thing that the drug is acting on is not the same. Like the toxicity is a side effect, but the thing that the chemotherapy is acting on like it's a different process. So
yes.
Yeah, I'm not sure if like the exact same model would apply.
Yeah, I agree the exact same model wouldn't apply. Like what I was imagining would apply is the same modeling, but now you have a G and an H.
Yeah, exactly.
And
then
they're both
on G.
Yes.
Probably could be easier because it would be like strictly negative.
They would be completely separated, which might I actually think it might be a bit easier.
I think so.
Because they're like fully separated. Here in addiction, this is like is for kind of any system in the body, which is observed most in the brain, but there's other systems where we have like a process that acts in a way and the counterbalancer. And I think there's in the brain, like we have the receptors that release, and like this is a huge simplification, and the receptors that like absorb. So there's like this dual action. And we study some well-behaved subtype of these opponent processes. Like again, like Solomon's description just says it's positive and then negative. That could allow for kind of anything. It could allow for weird variations. So we focus on what we call linearly progressing opponent processes, where it's just an opponent processes for which there exists some alpha between 0 and 1, so that the decay is sub-exponential with like some rate alpha until the switch, and like on the part where the response is positive, and then it's slower after. So this means that the acute effect decays faster than the tolerance effect, which again, I'd say fits most models and discussions of neurotransmitter adaptations. Again, this might be a bit, this is just exaggerated. Like technically what happens is like, this is like what, like this, and then this would be much more subtle, but have a longer tail. And yeah, this is exactly what you said. So there's further work by Kub and Moal, I think. Hope I'm pronouncing right. Yeah, I guess they call it neuropsychopharmacology. And this formalizes allostasis as what happens, like as a chronic deviation of the regulatory system from like the baseline under repeated administration of a drug. So this is how you would be in your baseline, but if you keep taking these medications that have this like lingering negative effect, then slowly over time, because they have longer, the decay over like a longer time, they will accumulate. So even though it's maybe imperceptible from one single dose, over time, your system will adjust to that. So for example, maybe this will be an example people relate to. If you drink a lot of coffee, then you will start needing coffee because you will not produce as much adenosine because it's just, there's an adaptation to that. So
Totally related.
You relate? Yeah, right? So you're more tired than you would have been before you started drinking coffee. And yeah, and these have been used a lot in opioid, to model like opioid addiction. And this is exactly the system we like assume and study. And these are some examples of linearly progressing opponent processes that we've simulated with different behaviors. This is one that like a drug that has an immediate slight good effect and a really, this is the impulse response, like a really imperceptible negative tolerance. And yet over time, we can see that if you take it, for example, every day as you would a medication, then over time you actually do see tolerance, even though, see, if you just look at the impulse response, it's very limited. Like, for example, this would be maybe something like Prozac, let's say, where if you take one drug, you like, maybe this would even be lower there, like you feel just a bit, and then you feel not like you don't feel any withdrawal really, but there is a slight tolerance that actually accumulates over time. And this is like over 60 administrations. And here we see the behavior that we saw in the previous graphs for allostasis, like with, if we interrupt dosing, this would be more characteristic of things you take on an as-needed basis or like addictive behavior. And yeah, so these are different examples for different types. This is the one that has like extreme acute effect, and then slight tolerance, slight tolerance. I think this would fit like stimulants. This is one that has a very strong immediate effect and quite strong with like immediate also withdrawal reaction. This would fit like immediate acting opiates, a lot of drugs of abuse. And yeah, this is more like the other one is just moderate positive, some negative. And yeah, so in this class of, oh my God, I'm so behind. Okay. In this class of systems, we are actually able to like derive explicitly, if we assume we know the system, if we know the underlying natural progression, if we just know everything, we're able to prove that taking the minimum effective dose, so the dose that either induces perfect constraint satisfaction or is zero because you cannot take a negative dose of a substance, ensures that you will maintain your well-being above the desired baselines at all times with minimal cumulative dose. So this is a very, in our opinion, I'll skip the proof. This is a very strong interpretation, though it's not, even though it assumes full system knowledge, it really reduces the problem of optimal tapering to one of set point matching. It also says that you do not need to plan a predetermined protocol. If you knew every day exactly the dose that you should take to perfectly match your constraint, then you could take that, and that would be optimal. You actually do not have to really concern yourself with what you'll do in the future. That is actually like just optimal in this framework. Again, it's in this framework, but of course, the issue is that we would need clairvoyance to actually know at each time what is the absolute dose that we would take to feel exactly exactly at the constraint, because we don't know like all the effect of all the past doses. We do not know in the morning if exactly how ready for the day will be. We don't know the effect, the cumulative effect of having decreased doses in the past or having taken an extra dose. So, but this is like one of the two main results we have, that we can reduce this problem of optimal tapering to one of set point matching. And the great thing is that set point matching in control theory is extremely well studied. This is what makes, ACs keep the temperature at temperature you put. This is just like one of the key things that's done in control, and generally use proportional integral derivative controllers. And so, inspired by this, we propose a very simple approach that's based on integral control. So, kind of one of the most canonical and simple algorithms there is in control. So this is maybe a very small remark, but actually Ben has this paper that's maybe too technical, but integral control is actually, in a sense, can be thought of as equivalent to gradient descent. So actually how we first got to this is that gradient descent works you kind of do gradient descent on the deviation from the constraint, because it's the constraint that you want to match. So this is the simple protocol we propose, where, let's see if I have, yes, where you choose your dose based on your past dose and based on two parameters, depending on, given like last time I measured, was I above my desired constraint or was I below the constraint? So it's very intuitive, and it's equivalent to like having gradient descent on an L2 deviation from the constraint. It's just that you have different rates for whether you're above or whether you're below, and this will help us like have a result on, it will help us in a safety guarantee. That's why we have different things. But yes, so it's very interpretable. It's like, well, if I felt much better than my constraint, or like better than my constraint, then I have some room and I will decrease my dose by a bit. And if I felt worse than my constraint, then I will increase my dose. So it's actually extremely intuitive. It's like what maybe you do heuristically.
Yeah.
But so, and the fact that it looks a bit messy, it's not just gradient descent, it's just because it's impossible to take a negative dose, so we clip at 0. And yes, as I said, we have different rates of update, like whether you're above or below your constraint. And we wrote it like with minus both places because that's how integral control is written. But notice that here it's like minus, but this will be a negative thing. So it's minus. And the second main theorem of our paper is that for any underlying natural state progression, this protocol ensures that at any time during your tapering, your average well-being will be greater than your desired baseline, minus some term that's based on the deviation from the how much you were above the constraint at the beginning. This would be like your base state when you're taking the drug. So this would be a positive thing over T. And that means like it's decaying linearly. So for example, if this was on a scale from 1 to 10, like how well I'm feeling from 1 to 10, and you don't want to feel lower than a 5, and in the beginning you're usually like taking this medication, you feel like a 7, then for example, in just 10 steps, this would be 2 over 10. So it would be 0.2, which on a scale from 1 to 10, it's guaranteed like, and then like, 20, it would be like 0.1. So it would be like your average well-being within like 20 updates of the algorithm will be 5 minus 0.1. So we have a guarantee on of your well-being will be at least 4.9. And this is like very interpretable. Like I think it's very like the one time in my life where I had an online learning algorithm that has an actually interpretable guarantee, like fully interpretable. And this is provided that, this is the thing I mentioned at the beginning, that you have some estimate of the immediate felt response. And this is like based on how you set the gain parameters, the parameters of your dose update. So, but notice that you can just like, this is the inverse, but it's like all you need to know is a rough lower bound and an upper bound, and then this guarantee will hold. So this is the average well-being, the well-being constraint, and linear decay. If we have some additional assumptions that are a bit stronger, so this is if we assume that we've discretized our medication update schedule such that we kind of like we encompass the fully felt effect within one dose update. So for example, if taking a dose today has a positive effect on me today and tomorrow, then we could if we update the dose like every 2 days or every 3 days, anything that's like more rough than the actual length of the positive effect. So this is one condition. This would generally you'd be able to discretize this way based on knowledge of half-lives. So if the half and just general dose response, like, but it is a challenge. Like would be like, we actually didn't write it up fully. Maybe we should add an appendix. We actually know how to kind of identify this. But it has, I think rather than doing an algorithm, this would have to be more of a like, this could be per substance, but there's a way to identify this as well. And then the assumption here, and this is a bit less interpretable than other things, but the assumption is like, if your natural progression doesn't go down in a way, like, or goes up at a certain rate. So it's like how if I had stopped the drug, how I would feel at time t+1 is how I feel at time t minus the effect that like having of the dose I took it, like the very first dose I took, times the effect it would have on today, plus some linearly increasing term. So this is less fully interpretable, but like delta can be very small. So this means in common language that if you were to fully stop the drug cold turkey, if you were to get better, generally, like if you just get better at this rate. So I would say this should hold for the delta being very small, because, and especially after sometimes, because we know that people generally get better. Like if you were to stop and you didn't take drugs again, the medication again, your natural state in general, like, will recover to its baseline. So it's kind of just saying that, it's just saying that your state will recover to its baseline, but it's saying at a certain, like it's imposing a rate. But yeah, so I think this is a stronger assumption, but under this stronger assumption of like improvement under cold turkey, which cold turkey means you stop fully, then we can guarantee that our protocol prescribes doses that are non-increasing, which is a very nice thing to have. Like you'll just know you'll always be decreasing your dose. They maintain feasibility perfectly over time. So it's no longer just the fact that your average well-being is bigger than the desired constraint, but rather at every single time you're satisfying the constraint. And finally, the doses will reach zero in finite time. So kind of a slightly stronger assumption on improvement rates. But if you do have that, then you kind of have all you could want for a tapering protocol. Like you'll always decrease your dose, you'll maintain feasibility at every single time, and you're gonna reach zero. So now I'll show you how it would work in practice. So you start at some dosage of a drug. And for that would be, if it's a medication that you're taking, for example, ADHD medication or Prozac, this would be your usual dose. This is, well, here it's written for like every day. Again, probably how often you want to update your dose, like really depends on the half-life. I would actually say that clinically this shouldn't be so hard to say. Like I would say you could do, for example, for nicotine, you could do every day. Probably this is a bit too extreme. Maybe people will do it every week. But yeah, so how it works is that in the beginning, the patient specifies their particular tolerance. For example, the one I've been using throughout is, I don't want to feel less than a 5 out of 10 every day. Then the protocol prescribes the dosage of the day, each day, or the discretization period to the patient. And then at the end of the day or the time period, the person journals how they felt. And this would be according to some scale. So the patient could either use existing scales like subjective opiate withdrawal scale or the SSRI withdrawal scale, or they could use, and then, well, in that case, everything would be flipped. But it works the same, you just literally flip everything. Or they could use, for example, the metrics that are already used to prescribe the medication in the first place. So for example, whenever you get prescribed Adderall, for example, for ADHD, you get prescribed that medication because you've scored high on an ADHD questionnaire. So for example, you could use that, or you could use how you feel. Our method works for any way you describe your metric, if it satisfies the assumptions. And then you give a lower and upper bound on this immediately felt effect, which again could be either based on averages from population or your personal knowledge. This would kind of be like, according to this like little questionnaire I'm doing, if I take like my usual dose, how much of an effect do I feel compared to if I don't take it? And knowledge of these lower and upper bounds leads to us knowing how to set our gain parameters. And then, so if you have today's dose, you have yesterday's dose, and you have a record of how you felt. So for example, you start with some initial dose, then you record that you felt like a 7 taking your usual dose. So there's room to decrease. So you decrease according to our protocol, which you could compute in a spreadsheet or in a journal, but I guess there's some multiplication. And then the protocol would say 20 milligrams the next day, and then you'd feel like a 6. And then again, you have some space. So then the protocol would decrease to 15. Then you feel like a 5. And then maybe because there's some compound effect over time that now you're not getting, you took 15 again, and then you feel like a 4.5, which is below your constraint. So then the protocol would increase it back to 20. And then you'd feel like 6. And then, and again, this is actually like, this is not from like a model. This is like how, like just an example. Then, yeah, and so on. And over time, it will decrease. So yeah, this is like how one would work if they wanted to, would implement it in practice. And finally, I think I only have 5 minutes left. Are some numerical simulations. Of course, the biggest challenge is that we cannot try this thing in practice, and there's no simulators really, and there's modeling of instantaneous dose responses for all these medication, but there's no modeling of how tolerance develops. We do not know that. So we do simulations in these examples I've presented before that are based to match like more like qualitative experiences of people and like how you think would act. Yeah. And yeah, so these are our experimental results. So this would be, the red line is like a very common protocol in the literature, which decays the dose linearly at some rate alpha. And we do, we experiment like how this would behave in like 100 patients that have uniformly sampled constraints. And we use the same underlying system for all of them, because I think one challenging experience, like there's so many things that could be varied, but yeah. So they have like the system that we discussed before, but they have just different constraints. And we test all possible rates you could do with linear, and we test all possible rates you could do with exponential. And for us, for our algorithm to also have a line, we test whether you keep your constraint at y min, or you also add some padding to your constraint, which is something that, let's see if I can go. Maybe I shouldn't. This is too much. But in our result, the integral controller theorem had something like your average well-being is greater than this y min minus linearly decay term. So you could be like y min plus delta to have some padding. And that's what we do here to see like how it behaves if you have like, yes, just different levels of padding. So either you can make it more aggressive or more conservative. And this is the optimal protocol, which knows exactly, we also add disturbances to these patients, like how they experience like the natural progression. We add, so they're different. And this is the optimal one that knows everything because we're in a simulation. And we measure them in terms of average constraint violation on the x-axis and the average total dose on the y-axis. So we see that, and this is like the one I've actually introduced in the start one. So we see that on average, like there's a wide gap in performance between us and like the existing baselines because of this ability to adapt to individual patient needs. And again, I think here we have a GitHub. If you go to the paper, you can actually download the code, play with the notebook. You can try like what happens if, for example, they all have the same constraint, but they have like different variations of the systems. Generally, like these were the easiest experiments in my life to run because really like we didn't really like design the systems. We just chose whatever felt natural, but it generally like just worked better across the board. And this is without perfect knowledge of G0. This is assuming like taking your lower bound to be 50% of the true effect and your upper bound 150%. So quite wide. Yes. And we do see that like, again, I'd say that the main contributors are like two, and one is what's optimal, and the other is a way to approximate that. So we see that there's some gap between what we do and what's optimal. So for example, a neural network architecture that could perfectly predict, like given knows all your history and is able to predict the actual minimum effective dose for you that day, like that could close the gap. At the expense, you wouldn't have guarantees that we have. So there's a trade-off. But I think like there's definitely like space, but they're also like here it's like very well separated. And yeah, again, like this also works without it's well specified as an algorithm and works across subspaces and everything. Like here, this is like, in practice, we don't even have this line because what's done is like people run an RCT for this, and then they run an RCT for this, and they compare it.
What actually happens in life is just people try things out randomly.
Yes. So, I mean, this would be another thing to try, but this is being like, rather than seeing it as a fixed schedule, what happens if you see it as an algorithm and as a control algorithm?
So like, what happens if you, just to simulate how like a human would behave, is there a possible, like if you just randomly try stuff, like do like something like random search, like you just try dosages until you like converge to the 5. Could you converge to a 5 on a wrong dosage, or like can you end up with a solution that has different average total dose and completely different average constraint violation, but arrive there like by just random search? Because I guess that's kind of what people would do, is that they will. I think that your policy actually like looks like how people would behave, but I wonder like the natural behavior policy would deviate a lot from the linear integral control.
So I would say that like the main contribution is actually like formalizing something that is very natural.
Yeah.
Like it is very natural to do. I think the main difference from what people do is here they would literally record how they feel. So I think in general, people when they quit, actually they do something similar. Like, oh, if my impression is that I felt kind of worse, then I'll take a bit of a higher dose next time. And if I felt I feel like I can take more. So we actually do that.
They probably get there slower.
Yeah, so I would assume they get there slower because
they're not like on the optimal, like they're not on the gradient descent trajectory. They're just like strengths.
Yeah, so I feel like in their head they kind of do gradient descent, but I think part of the, in my opinion, contribution is like I think like the fact that you're journaling and the fact that you're actually tracking these things, because I think there's a lot of error in the fact that like your impression of how you felt might change from then to day, and if you don't have a well-defined metric and if you don't record it, then it would be but you would be, for example, one thing that happens is that because you don't have this external like recommendation, it'd be like I have a bad week and then I take a lot, and like I take a big dose, and then I think what happens a lot is that then people feel bad that they took a lot, so then they do that for multiple days, whereas this is more like like recentering and like is able to get around that. But yeah, I mean, yeah, so in a way it's giving power to something that's quite natural. So Ben and I like that. Yeah. And it's giving power to like a more heuristic approach, because right now in the literature they're like trying to estimate on average in everyone like the decrease in neurotransmitters for this particular substance, like the rate, and that is just like extremely, maybe one day we'll know, but it feels like before we are able to perfectly model all the responses of neurotransmitters in the brain, this works like just much more, this works much more naturally, I think. That's our opinion. Yeah. And here are some ablations over different types of upper bounds and lower bounds. Again, it's hard to do all of them, but for example, like, so this would be the better of the baselines, and this is like what happens if you put the upper bound and lower bounds perfectly. So so not necessarily like it's clear this is good. So it's actually okay to have a wider range. Like for example, this is like your lower bound is quite small, 150%, or here I think this is like if you know like your lower bound is like 50% of the true effect, and like even up to 300% of the true effect. So it seems like really from what the explorations we've done, it really seems like the upper bound on the effect is not very finicky. Like that actually, there's a lot of leeway. Like you really like, yeah, I think it works fine when it's 400%. So 4x the actual effect. So it's more like in the lower bound, you don't want to go too low. So you want to have, I'd say people to focus on like the lower bound, how they feel. And yeah. And yeah, so yeah, this is some estimate on the immediately felt effect. And This is another final plot which shows like the fraction of the people that can be tapered using our protocol. So the thing is like this was within like 60 dose updates. And because all these people have different constraints and different natural progressions, and because you're adapting to that, even if like you're able to taper still a good fraction, like it's not a fixed thing. So some people might be able to taper faster and more easily. So this algorithm like is able to fully taper like up to 50% of the people. Whereas if you had a prefixed dose update, you actually like that would predetermine whether you can taper someone in 60 days or not. And because like, for example, if you taper by like over 60 days, you can compute like the alpha that you need to get to zero in 60 days. And that would like if that were imposed on everyone, like if they don't drop out, like either everyone tapers or in 3 days or not. And the thing is that like here we didn't plot like what the other methods would do, because in order for them to have like they would be 100% here, they would like fully taper if we set them to be able to taper within our time horizon. But the average constraint violation would be like extremely huge. Like it would be outside the plot. So that's why we don't plot it. And yeah, okay, I'm so sorry, I ran over time. So the main conclusion is that we propose a control theoretic and online optimization framework for the problem of tapering medications and addictive substances. Then maybe we should have said, maybe I should have said psychoactive medications generally. Any medication that has this opponent process type response, which is a bit more than psychoactive, but I don't know if like fully is. And yeah, so the fact that this framework allows us to drive like optimal tapering protocol that is substance agnostic and adaptive to individual patient needs, both via the metric and via the constraint. And we also derive an integral control-based tapering protocol that requires, in our opinion, minimal system knowledge and can be easily implemented by the patient. And yeah, I think preliminary simulations show like quite a big margin in terms of safety and efficacy compared to existing approaches by really harnessing the fact that if you adapt to a particular person, you have much more power in a way. So this is it. I'm sorry for running over.
No, thank you. I wonder if have you thought about like running an RCT for your tapering protocol?
I would love to. I just don't.
Very feasible.
Yeah, because I think this is one. So here, Ben and I really focused on one problem because we just had all the pieces to make it work. It's much harder, I think, to have something that works in general. But like here, I think like the cool thing is like it should work quite well in an RCT because it increases on every single person. It also increases on average. Like it increases.
But I mean, like you can randomize your protocol.
Yeah.
In like an actual clinic.
Yeah, I would love that.
Yeah. So like half of the people just do whatever they are already doing.
Yeah.
Half of them follow your.
Yeah.
And it would be easy to measure the subjective.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, it doesn't even have to be subjective. Like, yeah, how I would run this is also why I included that slide on how you'd run this practice. Like, I think you'd literally have like a spreadsheet. Like, it would be very easy to implement. And again, all this related work already is assessing one substance and one metric. So we could compete on the same metric. Yeah. That's completely fine. And the same discretization as they do. Yeah. So that's what we want. So it's just hard to find how.
Definitely do this because it's also like the outcomes are very short term. Like it's not like a trial that you will run in 2 years or anything. It's like.
Yeah. If you have any advice, like this is amazing. This is also like why I wanted to make this more informal, because I think both Ben and I really believe this would work. Like, I think we believe this would work for reasons that are even extra what's in the math, actually. But again, this is just intuition, and of course we're biased. But yeah, what we'd really love is to try it in practice. But yeah, if you have any advice, anyway.
Think about a person who works with the same kind of drugs, because you don't want to like look at something that's very where like none of these assumptions would naturally apply.
Yeah, like I think opioids, nicotine,
Well, I actually
stimulants are the
yeah,
easiest.
actually the
Caffeine.
last group, yeah, I can.
Yeah, caffeine is like,
I know someone who works with patients with opioid addiction. Actually, she presented last group meeting. She's a clinician. I can ask her if she's actually like dealing with this tapering problem.
yeah, I would love to talk. Yeah, like anyone, if you have any feedback, because I think, yeah, it's hard to find. I mean, it's also because I guess I'm not in the community of people who actually run RCT, so I don't even know who I would go to.
Yeah,
But
it's probably like there's no one whose job is to run RCT. It's more like someone who deals with this problem, and he's a clinician.
yeah,
So they just have naturally access to this population, so like they can just run an RCT.
yeah. I'd love. Yeah, this is like what we really want.
Yeah, that's. I think I should do this actually.
Yeah. So do people think it would work?
I think so. I think like what may not work is like because you need like these bounds and like the GC. Like there are some like initial conditions for like computing everything. So how is it like is it feasible in a practical setting to actually pin these things down? I'm not sure, but it seems like it should work. Like it's not like a counterintuitive policy or anything.
Yeah, I mean, I think I did thought experiments on like a bunch of things. And the best thing about the lower and upper bound is that it's quite like it works with quite rough estimates. So I would assume people, and also I think people do have responses on immediate, like on acute effects, according to metrics. I guess it's funny because I think immediate dose responses are more measured actually in terms of neurotransmitter availability. But if you have a model of how that leads to whatever scale, or if you also have measurements of that on the scale, I'd say actually, yeah, I'd say that my impression is that it should be doable to derive a rough range. And also, yeah, I guess this is done so that it's like fully formal, but it's also gradient descent. So that also gives me a lot of hope that it would work because really, if you know, gradient descent, I come from an online learning background. So gradient descent with a fixed learning rate does quite well if the learning rate is small enough. Like you wouldn't be able to, we have a very, like with the particular setting, we have a very interpretable bound that's very strong. But generally, if you just have two learning rates or even one, honestly, and it's very small, it should already do decently well. Is my impression. It's just you can do much better. So, because yeah.
Other questions? Thank you. Thanks, Nilo, if you are still awake. She's